Good afternoon and welcome. My name is David Feist and I will be the facilitator of this webinar today. Our presenters today are Vijay Krishna and Keith Mowry. Thank you for joining ANAB for our complimentary webinar on revision of 17024. Please note we are recording this webinar so it will be available for viewing in the future. A couple logistics that we should cover before we get started. Due to the high attendance, everyone will remain muted for the duration of this webinar. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box that you see. We have planned time at the end of the webinar to answer questions asked. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our presenters. Dr. Vijay Krishna is Vice President Credentialing at ANAB. He serves as an IAF representative on ISO Working Group 30 that is revising ISO 17024. He is also the co-convener of the IAF Working Group for Persons and convener of APAC ISO IEC Working Group. He is the chair of the IAF Task Force on Competence of Accreditation Body Assessors and Experts. He holds a doctoral degree in Human and Organizational Learning from George Washington University and has taught graduate level courses in many subjects. Keith Mowry is the ANAB Senior Manager of Accreditation, and he is a Senior Manager of Business Development. He collaborates with clients and schemes in all fields of conformity assessment to create and enhance conformity assessment solutions. He represents ANAB on the ANSI International Conformance Assessment Committee, ANSI ICAC, the U.S. Mirror Committee to ISO CASCO, including active membership and participation on the ANSI ICAC Subcommittee for ISO CASCO's Chair's Policy and Coordination Committee. Keith is also heavily involved in standardization activities at both tactical and strategic levels. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Chemical Engineering from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. With that, I will hand this session over to Keith and Vijay. Keith and Vijay?
Yep, thanks so much, David. And I just want to make a few comments to set the stage. Vijay has the information that everybody's most interested in. The ISO IEC 17024 standard is under the responsibility of the ISO Committee for Conformity Assessment, or ISO CASCO. And ISO CASCO, like all other ISO technical committees, follows the ISO rules or directives for managing their standards. The directives require that an international standard be opened for what's called a systematic review if that standard has not been revised in the previous 5 years. Between those systematic reviews, the committee responsible for the standard can open it up for revision simply by passing a resolution. Next slide, please. ISO, of course, participation in ISO is by country, and each country has a member body to ISO. Here in the United States, ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, is the member body to ISO. And within ANSI, the International Conformity Assessment Committee is the interface or the National Mirror Committee specifically to ISO CASCO. You can Google ANSI ICAC for more information, including how to join and how to get involved. There we are. Now, 17024 was published in 2012, and in the first 5 years, there was no resolution or proposal to revise it. So, per the rules in 2017, ISO CASCO issued a systematic review to CASCO members regarding 17024, and in that systematic review, the CASCO members voted to confirm 17024, that is, to continue publishing it with no revision. In the following 5 years, there was also no proposal or resolution to revise it, which brought us to the 2022 systematic review. And in that systematic review, the CASCO member bodies voted to revise the standard. There wasn't any specific issue or problem necessarily with the standard. I think most of the CASCO members simply felt that after 10 years, it was a good idea to open up the document and see if it needed to be revised or refreshed. So on the next slide, we see that on a systematic review, there are 3 options for CASCO members to vote: confirm the standard, as was done in 2017, revise the standard, which was done in 2022, or even withdraw the standard because it simply isn't needed anymore. It was an interesting statistics on the voting for the systematic review of 17024 in 2022. First thing is that almost a third of the participating members, the P members at ISO CASCO, didn't vote for any of those options. 19 voted to abstain and 14 didn't vote at all. Of the remaining 71, 44 voted to revise the standard, and that was a 62% majority, which was more than enough to bring the standard forward for revision. Now, the thing that I briefly want to point out before I hand it over to Vijay is that these numbers are very, very typical. And so it shows that even though personnel certification is actually one of the newer topics that ISO CASCO deals with, these numbers clearly show that 17024 is in the mainstream of all the ISO CASCO standards. So on the next slide, ISO CASCO, as a result of that ballot, formulated Working Group 30 to revise 17024 and called for experts. And Vijay Krishna of ANAB is an expert on the working group and will now talk us through some of the key topics and issues that are under discussion. Vijay, it's all yours.
Thanks, Keith. Welcome, everyone. This is going to be an opportunity to provide you insights into some higher level thinking that's happening at the working group that's revising the standard. As you're aware, the first time ISO 17024 was published was 2003. The next publication came out in 2012. And since 2012, in the past 10 years, things have changed dramatically globally in terms of what's happening with respect to certification of persons or personal certification, as we understand that in the United States. When the standard came out in 2012, it was very new for a lot of countries out there. And the whole concept of certification, competence assessment, and how is that different from qualification, training, education, required a lot of efforts, a lot of education globally. And as we understand, certification systems are very well developed in a few countries, but in a lot of countries out there, it's more educational training paradigm that they operate from. So when the standard went through the 2012 revision, there was a lot of focus on Clause 8, which is the scheme part of it, development of scheme, a lot of focus in terms of assessment, and looking in terms of how to bring in the best of what everyone else globally has to offer. And now that we are looking at it, things have changed, and I will highlight a few of these. Currently, we have a lot of interest globally in terms of implementation of ISO 17024. There is an IAF multilateral recognition arrangement in place. Many countries are signatories to the MLA. So a lot is happening in terms of how the standard is being impacted. So the working group that is working on revising the standard, there are about 70 members on the working group 30, coming from different countries, different economies. And these are the experts who are working actively on the revision of 17024. So let me just give you what's happening within the framework of working group 30 in terms of the conversations. So among the key issues that the working group 30 is looking for, obviously everyone these days is talking about artificial intelligence. Some of the certification bodies are using it. And the big question before the working group is how to actually address the use of technology. Now, throughout the implementation of 17024, certification bodies have used technology. So the use of technology in itself is not something new. But what has made it a lot more complex, interesting, challenging is that now we have technology that is in some sense autonomous and capable of making decisions on its own, which is different from what we had in the past, where technology was subservient to human interventions. So how do we handle artificial intelligence as a construct? Now, if you look at the use of AI, now we are also looking in terms of how best to define this, because AI is the most commonly used definition, but essentially we're talking about autonomous technologies that essentially is based on large volumes of data. And this is, I think, something really important for everyone to understand. That the data that is collected, annotated, it has to be correctly annotated, validated before a system can be trained. And then once the system gets trained, it comes in a position of making intelligent decisions on its own. But a lot goes behind in terms of having a system that's ready. Now, if you look in terms of what are the areas under 17024 where AI, I'll be using the word AI, but the idea here is in terms of autonomous systems. You can almost use AI in every field relating to certification of persons, starting with the development of the scheme. So if you look at the current Clause 8, it talks about how a job analysis needs to be done. You need to have subject matter experts involved. Now, you can envision a system where AI is playing a very active role in the development of scheme. Now, it can start all the way from doing literature review in terms of what would be the competence required for a specific job. It could be in terms of putting those competence in definable frameworks. We understand them as domains. And it can also be trained to look in terms of what kind of assessments would be most appropriate for that. So now the question then comes up is, what would then be the role of subject matter experts? Would the subject matter experts be looking at what the AI generated, initial competence framework would be, and then they would be the one who would finally approve it? Or can you, have it the other way around, where the AI would be empowered to actually play a major role in defining the scheme requirements? And at this time, and again, all of these things are going through discussions. The working group, I don't think, is comfortable allowing AI to be driving or making independent decisions without subject matter experts. Now, the scheme development AI could be actively involved in doing the background information work collection, but not in terms of actively making decisions. Similarly, when you think of assessments, you can have assessments that are done using AI systems. And in some cases, like for instance, we are all aware of exam essays that are graded using AI platforms like GMAT or GRE, which it's been something which has existed for several years now. So we are seeing examples where AI could be involved in assessments, whether it's a practical exam, whether it's a written exam. We can think of, probably many of you here have been looking at item generation, where exam items are initially developed using an AI platform. And then further to that, the subject matter experts would use that initial items that's developed using various AI platforms and then refine and work on that. Similarly, in terms of even handling complaints, appeals, some of it could be automated using, bots or technology. So all of these essentially falls within the framework of the, work group deliberations in terms of how to handle this. Now, again, this is all going through deliberation. We have a meeting of the working group coming up in November, where we'll have more clarity in terms of how the working group is going to deliberate and vote on that. But it is really worthwhile to know that probably some of you are actively involved in using some of these technologies for certification of persons. And I would think that, this is my opinion, that AI would be a system that would be, I would call it as a system that assists human beings, but not a system that would replace human beings or replace examiners. But again, there could be areas like remote proctoring. Would it be acceptable to have a system which is purely AI without a live proctor present? Right now, the 17024 requires an examiner or a proctor to be present. It uses the word present, and the working group is deliberating what does that, even the word present means. Does it mean real time, or can you have a session which is AI monitored? Again, all of these are very, very interesting conversations that's happening. And I'm sure, and I have been, talking to a few certification bodies that are actually testing out, trying out some of these systems in terms of how to use the technology out there. And my personal view is this is a very, very exciting technology that is going to have significant impact in terms of how certification bodies assess competence of people. And we have to get ahead to the extent possible, understanding this technology, because one of the things that will come up, in my opinion, is there would be requirements for, impartiality, threats, transparency, biases, how, when you use some of these systems, how does a certification body have an active mechanism to manage some of these concerns so that you can use technology, but you have sufficient safeguards, because at the end of the day, you're talking about making sure people have the competence to practice. So some of the other issues that are being discussed, and I'm happy to respond to any specific questions at the end of the presentation. You're welcome to type these questions in the chat box if you have any follow-up questions. But again, it's very, very interesting times, and as you can think of, the standard is a global standard. So again, in terms of schemes, and there is discussion in terms of, there are different types of schemes that we have seen over the years, starting with ISO standards that, have requirements for competence of people. For instance, non-destructive testing standards or the vibration analyst requirements. So there are many standards. It could be an ISO standard, it could be an American National Standard. So how does all of these schemes fit into Clause 8 requirements? Again, I'm not saying that the Clause 8 is going to change or what's going to happen, but these are active deliberations that's happening. So how do you handle transfer of certification? So if a person who is certified by one certification body for a variety of reasons, let's assume that person is now going to a different country now and wants to carry forward, transfer his or her certification to a certification body in that country, how would that transfer happen? In some countries, they are having the issue of dissolutions of CBs for a variety of reasons. So how do people who have certifications with a specific CB, continue to work with other CBs, transfer them. And then also this concept of flexible schemes, which we have not really seen a lot of schemes titled specifically as flexible schemes, because this was relatively something new that was recognized in the ISO 17011 standard. But then what would that flexible schemes would mean when we talk about certification of persons? So again, these are some very, very high level issues, very, very interesting discussions happening. And I'm sure what will come out of some of these deliberations is going to lead, in my opinion, to a lot more richer standard, which will provide more clarity, directions in terms of how to handle some of these challenges that all people who are working with certification bodies for persons are working with. Now, moving on to some other issues that the working group is also considering. Again, recertification. We are seeing in some areas and in some countries specifically where technology is changing so fast. How does that allow for some of the existing recertification models to fit into newer types of credentials in some cases that are coming up? So again, this is a discussion. It's nothing as formalized yet, that there are other credentials which have elements common to personal certification. Now, they might have 90%, 80% similarity with certification, but they might have a few differences. Now, where should the boundary be in terms of defining what a certification of persons? Right now, we are very, very clear. Is there a need to relook at some of these areas, emerging credentials, or would that be totally outside the scope of certification of persons? Again, I'm not saying things are going to change, but these are really rich discussions to have in terms of recertification. And again, in many countries, surveillance, it's a very active component of ensuring people have continued competence. Now, those of you who have worked with the 2003 version of the standard would remember that there was a requirement for surveillance. And in some countries with some ABs, it generated a lot of issues in terms of what is surveillance? How is it different from recertification? Now, in the 2012 edition, that was made kind of voluntary in the sense that a scheme can have requirements for surveillance. It would be different from recertification. So surveillance is something that you do in between the interval of initial certification and recertification. So there is a possibility that a scheme could require surveillance assessments. But again, overall, the whole concept of recertification, what are the best practices out there? What is it that would be acceptable? And if you look at recertification requirements in 1702 for current version, in some sense, it provides you a good list of the options that are available to you as a certification body. It could be an assessment, it could be an exam, it could be continuing education, work samples, work portfolio. So there are different ways by which a certification body can ensure continued competence. But again, it's an interesting topic for discussion. One of the challenges that came up before Working Group 30 was specifically when the pandemic broke out. Some of the certification bodies were not able to perform every requirement that 1702 requires a certification body to do. So for instance, difficulty in administering practical exams, especially when it's an on-site practical exam, because the testing centers, the practical exam centers had to be shut down. So the question came up is, are there critical clauses that needs to be met every single time, or is there a flexibility in terms of some clauses where there could be some leeway to be able to document other means of compliance to those requirements? Again, very, very interesting concept. I don't see, again, my personal view, I don't think there is going to be any kind of exceptions, or I don't think there is going to be defining that these are the critical clauses that you have to meet and other clauses are going to be optional. That's not going to happen. But again, a very, very important discussion based on some of the challenges that certification bodies have had to face. And to the credit of ISO and the working group, when different member countries bring forward different challenges that their constituent certification bodies face, the working group takes upon itself the responsibility to actually go through an active deliberation process, look in terms of the implications for that, so that those challenges can be addressed in some form or the other. And again, the other area where there is a good bit of discussion happening relates to Clause 8. I don't personally, again, in my view, I don't think Clause 8 is going to change much, but there might be one or two additional requirements, or there might be some elaboration in terms of Clause 8. Now, as you very well recognize, the certification scheme can be developed by the certification body per se, which is a proprietary scheme. And at the same time, there could be an external scheme owner that develops the scheme requirements and then typically would have a licensing arrangement with the certification body that would use that scheme. In the United States, there are external scheme owners that work closely with ANAB, and it's a model that is more prevalent in some countries. But again, there could be more interest in maybe a government agency, a trade association to be involved with development of schemes. So again, some deliberations in terms of when external scheme owners develop the certification scheme, is there anything else that either needs to be added to Clause 8 or clarified the language? And as you understand and recognize that this is a global standard, and some of the terms are used different in different countries. So the committee is very mindful in terms of making sure that the words that are actually written in the standard work well for the entire global community, which is the stakeholders for the use of the ISO 17024. Moving on to some other key issues that the working group is looking at. One is just the alignment of the standard. In the past, if you have been working on 17024, the 2012 edition, sometimes you look at a requirement in the standard and wonder, did we already answer this question? Is this situated appropriately in this specific section, or should it be moved to a different section? For instance, when we look at records or information. Now, the standard talks about information that should be publicly available without request, and not publicly available. So is there a need, or can the standard look better? Can the standard be more efficiently organized? And then there is an ISO document, Prop 33, which essentially talks about the mandatory requirements in the 17,000 series standards, whether it's 17065, 17025, 21. The reason is there could be certification bodies that are accredited or use multiple 17,000 series standards. So there could be a certification body that uses or is accredited under 17065, 17024. In fact, ANAB has multiple certification bodies that are accredited for multiple standards, 17024 and 65. Similarly, it could be 65 and 21, 25. So the idea behind the common structure is that the standards, 17,000 series standards, look similar to the extent possible, and the requirements that are common across the 17,000 series standards, like impartiality, management system, the structure of a certification body, uh, you know, we use the same language, we use the same structure so that it looks similar and helps certification bodies that use multiple standards. So again, this is going to be something which the working group is incorporating. So you might see some realignment in terms of numbering system. We don't want to change more than what is required because we understand certification bodies already have systems, management system, documents numbered to and written to the existing standard. But at the same time, we can always improve upon the wording. We can always improve upon the structure. We can remove redundancies and duplication and make it a lot more user friendly. So that as more and more certification bodies globally use it, as the standard gets recognized by more agencies, government entities, stakeholders, people who use the standard feel good about how the standard is overall written and the words, which I do believe the existing standard has. And again, looking at improvements. Some of the other areas that Working Group 30 is looking at is data. Now, this is again becoming more and more important as policymakers, decision makers start looking at certification as an important credentialing, as part of the credentialing system, an important credential. And so the need for data becomes more and more important. In the United States, there is currently an initiative which is looking at just getting started, which is looking in terms of how some of the data could be tied to a national data trust, to outcomes, wages, earnings, just like we have for degrees, educational institutions within the United States, which will then bring certification to the mainstream, and there is going to be quantifiable actual data to support some of the impact and the great work certification is doing in terms of helping people find high-paying jobs, wage earnings. So again, nothing is out there, but what I said that we need to have at a minimum, like right now, when you look at certification bodies, the type of data that certification bodies are collecting, it varies significantly. Some of the certification bodies, for instance, might be collecting data relating to demographics, different groups and subgroups, male, female, ethnicity. Some may not be doing it. Now, I'm not advocating for one or the other, but the thought is there something that would need to be required under the 17024 standard in terms of this is the data that needs to be collected? Again, very, very interesting discussions happening around it. maybe something might come out, maybe nothing might change. Maybe exactly it remains the same in terms of data collection. We don't know yet. The other interesting topic that is going through some discussion is just like talking about psychometrics assessment. In the United States, the word psychometrics is used. In many other countries, they use the essential principles of psychometrics, but they probably use some other words. So the whole idea is, how do we have a system which is robust globally, which looks at assessment to ensure that the assessment in the standard which is currently defined as fair, valid, and reliable. And the whole body of psychometrics, as we understand, is all about these three key constructs, like fairness, validity, reliability, and what's the evidence for each of these constructs. So the discussion around is in terms of, is there a need for adding any additional language to clarify? I don't see that there is going to be more than these three words, reliability, fairness. But how do we help certification bodies and accreditation bodies globally come up with some of the fundamental concepts that are critical to assessment? Now, without these fundamental assessment criteria, the assessment associated with certification of persons would not have the evidence to support the claim that the certification bodies ensuring people who are certified can perform the job. Again, 17024 talks about a criterion referenced assessment. It uses the word validity of pass-fail decisions. Now, we understand the word validity of pass-fail decision as a cut score study. Again, how do we embellish it? How do we define it in a manner that there is more clarity, especially in economies and countries where they may not be familiar with psychometrics? And then also in terms of assessment, we are seeing that in some countries, in some sectors, there is emphasis on continuous assessment to ensure people have competence to perform. So it's not just testing once every 5 years. There is more, on a continuum, instead of thinking of it as discrete events, starting year 1 and then year 5. Some certification bodies, especially in critical sectors where technology is changing really rapidly, are experimenting, using some very, very innovative assessment. And this is, again, becoming possible because of the new autonomous technologies that are emerging, which did not exist in the past. So how do we look at some of these newer types of assessments that are now coming into the fray, are now coming slowly in terms of in the mainstream, and define if any additional requirements are required. The working group is also looking in terms of outsourcing, subcontracting in the context of emerging technologies like AI. So with more and more certification bodies using different vendors for different types of technology platforms for various functions which did not exist in the past, the scope of outsourcing probably might change in the coming years with more reliance on technology related work outsourced. So how does the standard accommodate some of those requirements for outsourcing, subcontracting, and then what would be the responsibility of the personnel employed or working for the certification body? How what would be the evidence to show that they have the competence that is required for oversight, for evaluation of some of the technologies that could be outsourced. So, for instance, sometimes there could be lack of clarity in terms of algorithmic bias, or there could be lack of clarity in terms of how the technologies are being used. So in some cases it could be like a black box where an outsourced vendor would say, okay, I'm going to do something with like your data is going to be miraculously transformed into something that would be usable to you. So what would be the level of oversight required? And this would be similar to when the outsourcing requirement were instituted more strongly in the 2012 version of the standard. The concept of psychometrics. Many certification bodies do not have an in-house psychometrician. They would outsource that to a vendor or an outsourced company to do that. And so the question that came up was, what is the level of expertise that is required at the certification body level to evaluate the work of a psychometrician or psychometric work? So this would be similar to that in terms of how when a certification body is now outsourcing, subcontracting some of the critical functions, important things that historically has been done in-house. How should the outsourcing, subcontracting clauses or fences or guards be constructed to essentially ensure that there is responsibility that ultimately lies with the certification body for all certification decisions. And this is one thing which I can almost assure you, that certification decisions cannot be outsourced in the current version, and it cannot be outsourced to an AI platform to make those decisions too. So some of these things in terms of emerging technologies are also interesting decisions happening within the Working Group 30. As we move on to some of the other issues that Working Group 30 is looking at, I briefly talked about surveillance, use of marks. Again, these are some of the questions that have emerged. I don't foresee too many changes, but again, with many certification bodies using QR codes, digital badges, newer ways of using technology to issue, the certification. So that's posing questions both for the certification body as well as the accreditation body, and as well as for the individual users. So some of the things that we are seeing innovations are fabulous. It really helps to prevent fraud and ensure that the marks are used and governed appropriately. At the same time, there needs to be safeguards in place so that these marks are not misused. So general discussions around that. Operational and organizational controls that needs to be in place. And the last two are also very, very critical in terms of clarifying the conditions for certifying own employee or employees. I was talking to a certification body yesterday, and one of the things that they brought to my attention when we're talking is the pandemic in many ways has changed some of the things that used to be for granted in the past. For instance, access to volunteers, subject matter experts. But sometimes some certification bodies and subsectors are seeing shrinkage of that. What happens when you have employees who have the certification or who have the expertise to contribute to the content, either in terms of scheme or in the examination assessment. And these employees also want to be certified. So, what what would be appropriate safeguards that needs to be in place. We are also seeing organizations which want to roll out certifications for their own employees, like big entities. And the idea is to create a separate unit, department, which would be predominantly certifying employees in that organization. So we have had examples in the United States with labor unions certifications, where you have to be a member of the labor union to be able to take the certification test. So again, newer dynamics in terms of how these needs to be looked at in the revision of 17024. And last but not the least, again, this is an overview of some of the high level topics. It's not an exhaustive list. We are having our third working group meeting coming up in November, end of November. So there could be some new issues that could come up. But an important issue is in terms of gender sensitivity, making sure that the language is sensitive to different types of people who are using it, making sure that there are right now several ISO guidance documents in terms of how the wording of the standard should be written to accommodate for gender sensitivity. So again, this is something that you might see happening, which might again be one of the positives to make sure that it does not exclude any stakeholder groups. So again, these are very, very high level issues that the working group is deliberating. I don't know, what the final outcome is going to look like, but I can certainly say that having people from 70 plus countries actively participate in the working group brings out issues which helps benefiting the entire world. And then once the draft standard is developed, it goes through a balloting process that Keith, I think, will elaborate on that. But from the content perspective, I don't see, the standard is going to be turned upside down and some new requirements are going to come up, which is going to be onerous for certification bodies to implement. What I personally, again, my view is the certification bodies are currently grappling through multiple challenges, both in terms of technology, in terms of the residuals from the pandemic. Things have changed, and some of the things are not going back to pre-pandemic times. So how can the standard provide a strong foundation, a framework to support what certification bodies do? Because that's the whole purpose behind having a standard which is rich, which is progressive, which allows, to the extent possible, future proofing, so that what we end up writing today does not become obsolete tomorrow in the very near future. At the same time, recognizing that this is a global standard, it is used across sectors, and so it may not have all the prescriptive elements that one economy or one sector would want, but certainly there could be performance criteria that could be added or would be added that will provide more clarity in terms of how certification bodies can use these technologies, address these issues, so that at the end of the day, certification bodies have a stronger program, and the accreditation bodies have clear criteria for their evaluations. With that, I will turn it over to Keith.
Thanks so much, Vijay. Just to finish up fairly quickly here, the $34,000 question is almost always, so when is the revised standard going to be published? And of course, the answer is always the same and is always unpopular, and it's that it depends. But what I'll do to finish up today is I will speculate with a capital S, speculate on perhaps the fastest possible path that 17024 could follow and its revision be published. So VJ referenced the next working group meeting is at the end of November. And so in my speculation here, I'm going to speculate that after that working group meeting, I'm going to speculate that the working group is going to arrive at a draft revision of the standard that is ready for a committee draft ballot. That's the first ballot of a revised document that goes out to all the CASCO member bodies. And on that ballot, it's 8 weeks. That ballot lasts for 8 weeks. And all the CASCO member bodies are asked for comments, not a vote per se, actually just comments. So I'm going to speculate that if the next working group meeting at the end of November arrives at a fairly cohesive, finished, revised draft, that ballot will take place in January and February of 2024 on the 8-week ballot. After that, all these member bodies to ISO CASCO, when they submit their comments, the working group has to then sort through and decide how to resolve or dispose of all those comments. And there can be many comments. As a matter of fact, some CASCO revisions ballots generate over 1,000 comments. And so it's a big job for the working group to figure out not only how the comments all fit together, which ones are persuasive, what kind of changes might or might not be made to the revised draft. And I'm going to speculate that the working group, after this speculative January, February committee draft, the working group will be busy doing that from March to May of 2024. Now, there can be a variety of conclusions that the working group comes to as a result of that committee draft ballot and the consideration of the comments. In the fastest path, the working group would decide that the document, as kind of amended or revised based on the comments, that the document is now ready for a draft international standard ballot. And that's the fastest scenario. The slower scenario would be that the working group decides that as a result of the comments, they think they need to make some pretty significant or major changes to the revision. And in that case, the working group could decide to go out for a second committee draft ballot to get more comments on the very significantly changed version of the revision. But in my scenario here, I'm going down the fastest path, and the fastest path would be that after the comments are considered, that the working group issues a draft international standard ballot, and that by rule lasts for 12 weeks. And so I'm speculating here that under the best of conditions, that ballot would maybe be issued during July through September of 2024. And in that ballot, the CASCO member bodies actually do vote. They vote to approve or disapprove, and they can also continue to submit comments. At the end of that ballot, if there are no technical changes that the working group feels are necessary as a result of the draft international standard ballot, and that draft international standard ballot is approved by 2/3 of the CASCO members who are voting, and that draft international standard is not disapproved by more than 1/4 of the members voting. If all of those conditions are met, at the end of that draft international standard ballot, the revision can go directly to publication by ISO. Obviously, that would be the fastest scenario. If those voting results are different, you get approval, but not by 2/3, or you get more than 1/4 of the voting bodies disapproving, or as a result of the draft international standards ballot, the working group feels we actually do need to make some technical changes based on what the feedback we've got. In any of those scenarios, then there's another ballot. It's called the final draft international standard ballot. But I'm going down the fastest path in my speculation here. So I'm going to speculate that at the end of the draft international standard ballot, that all these conditions are met and the document can go directly to publication. That would indicate that the final revised 17024 would be published by ISO. Again, speculating, under the fastest conditions, it would be issued in the fourth quarter of 2024. For its use, for 17024's use as a set of requirements for accreditation, then of course there's another step that's taken at the International Accreditation Forum, the IAF. The IAF member and participating bodies come together and they consider the nature of the revision of the standard, and IAF defines a transition period that all the IAF member bodies will adhere to, and that's the amount of time that accredited bodies have to come into compliance with the new revised standard. And depending on the nature of the revisions, that transition period is very typically maybe 2 or 3 years. So if we think maybe at the fastest it would be a 2-year transition period, then the kind of the very end of the chain of events for bodies who are accredited is that they would need to come into compliance with the revised 17024 by the end of the fourth quarter of 2026. So now, again, just I've said it a bunch of times, I'll say it once more, that's completely speculative. It's just a kind of a fastest possible scenario just to give you a yardstick that you can use to, as events unfold, then you can compare and say, oh, well, this is actually a little slower than that yardstick that I heard about, or, oh, no, this is on track with that yardstick I heard about. Hopefully it gives you some value as the working group finishes its work, the revised standard is published, and the IAF takes a decision on transition times. So thanks so much, and back to you, David.
Thank you, Vijay and Keith. That was a great presentation. We've had quite a few questions that have come in, and we're going to get to those very quickly after we discuss a couple of additional resources that are available for laboratories and for anyone seeking accreditation. As we look at this, you know, our webcasts and our webinars are available. They're free. They're live informational sessions, and we're offering them monthly on a variety of topics. Our blog page has a wealth of information related to risk, accreditation standards requirements, and a lot of other topics. And we also offer live, online, in-person, and self-paced training in a lot of areas, including internal auditing, standard requirements, measurement confidence, risk analysis, etc. We're very pleased that you've chosen to spend some time with us today. These two gentlemen are experts in 17024. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. There's a question that will today's slides be made available? The answer to that is this webinar is being recorded and will be publicly available for review. Vijay and Keith, one of the first questions we have in here, are there any guidelines to develop schemes which cover necessary steps for achieving ISO 17024 accreditation?
There is a guidance document that ISO has developed. If you just Google developing standard ISO guidance document on development of scheme class 8, it's probably going to be one of the first things that comes up. So that's certainly a good resource if you're looking for some guidance in terms of how to develop a scheme based on class 8 of 17024.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you very much. The next question is regarding recertification. For RCB, surveillance is discussed every year with our scheme commission, who've decided each time it would not be possible in our industry for the scope of our designation. Can you comment on this?
Right. Yeah. And thing is, like, I don't foresee surveillance is going to become a requirement, just like what you said in your industry, it may not be practical. And, you know, what you said is that's exactly the type of argument that we look forward. You said, okay, we took it towards subject matter experts and they determined this was not appropriate. So I don't think you need to be concerned. I don't see that changing.
Perfect. Dr. Krishna, can you provide any insight on best practices that certification bodies used during the 2003 to 2012 update to their processes to maintain ANAB accreditation during the cutover period? This may be helpful for those transitioning from the 2012 to 2024 version of 17024.
That's a good question, Jim. So what we did was we prepared a translation document which mapped out, okay, what was in 2003, what was changed, and we provided, intense workshops, and David probably will put together something to that effect. And we had clear-cut, presentations in terms of what changed. And what we also did was we tried to make it as seamless as possible. So we provided certification bodies options within that transition period, the 3-year transition period. We had a surveillance application with a new section, which was like an add-on for the new version of the standard. And if certification bodies wanted to do that, they could do that. But we didn't force anyone to do that because there was the transition window. For some certification bodies, it made sense to come into compliance when they came off a recertification. So we made that allowance in the reaccreditation application. So we have a lot of experience in terms of handling transition. We understand, it would require changes, and some of the changes would require efforts, documentation, and evidence. So we will do our best to have translation applications, some added guidance, and certainly workshops to help certification bodies as well as organizations that want to get accredited, figure out these differences. And it's also possible that, just like in the past, ISO also had some guidance documents, some presentations which were made publicly available to help certification bodies. IEF might put out some guidance documents. So there's going to be a lot of resources, and ANAB is going to be very, very proactive and will have a lot of resources made available.
Thank you. Our next question is, can we associate and approve training providers to provide trainings with our guidelines, and assessment will be done by us? Is there any accreditation in that scenario?
So what I'm hearing is, can a certification body approve or recognize training providers? Now, the standard does allow for that. Now, there are two things involved here. One is a certification body has a recognition program to allow for any approved training providers to be on that list. So the certification body would define criteria, and any training program that meets those requirements would have an equal opportunity to be recognized. That's one scenario. The other is a very unique situation where a certification body wants to recognize its own training program and say, you have to take my training program in order to meet the prerequisites or eligibility requirements. Now, as you can see, there are risks associated with that, in the sense that as a certification body, you would have to justify that why that should be accepted. Now, if there is no training outside which meets specific criteria as defined in the scheme, then that might be a possibility. Again, we don't really have much time to go into the nitty-gritty of these questions. But a short answer, both these scenarios are possible, provided there is a justification and a rationale to do that.
Thank you. It looks like we have two more questions which have come in. Early in the presentation, you mentioned that ISO CASCO does a review every 5 years. Are there conditions under which ISO CASCO allows these reviews to go longer than that 5-year period?
Well, yes. The rules that ISO publishes, which apply to all committees, technical committees, and ISO CASCO, indicate you need to do a systematic review if it's been 5 years since the last revision. However, all technical committees can adjust a little. I mean, they can't get way out of bounds with that, but they can adjust a little. And ISO CASCO in the past has done that because in some cases, a 17,000 series standard is tied fairly tightly or has a strong connection with other documents or other 17,000 series standards. And so sometimes CASCO will sequence the revision of those related standards in a particular order to try to make the decisions and any resulting revision processes as efficient and as effective as possible. With 17024, I believe that has not been the case to date, and one of the reasons is because, with one exception that we won't get into because of time constraints here, with one exception, 17024 in the 17,000 series kind of stands on its own. It doesn't. There aren't a lot of other documents that it interrelates to. So CASCO, it's fairly straightforward for CASCO to stick to that 5-year schedule for the systematic reviews.
Perfect. Thank you. There's a follow-up to the last question, Dr. Krishna, that you answered. In the case of scenario 1, if we approve a training provider with their own material, can our certification for the training provider be marked under ANAB accreditation?
I'm not sure what that means. Our accreditation we marked under our ANAB accreditation. So I'll just give you a little bit, and please feel free to reach out to me. You won't find it too hard to get my email address. It's vkrishna@anab.org. I'm happy to have a follow-up conversation in terms of what that looks like.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And there's one last question here that we'll cover, and then we'll conclude the webinar. There was a mention of P members on the committee. Are there non-P members, and if so, what is their role?
Yeah, sure. The P, meaning participating members, are the members, the ISO member bodies that are members of the specific committee, in this case ISO CASCO, and that actually vote. They have both the responsibility and the opportunity to cast a vote on an ISO CASCO ballot. There's another category of members, I think it's still in the directives, and I'll double check, and if this is not the case, I'll clarify by follow-up information, called observer or O members. And those are countries who are interested in the work of the committee. This is not unique to ISO CASCO. They're interested in the work of the committee, but for whatever reason, they don't feel as though that they have the resources or the expertise or the activity within their country to participate and cast votes. Now, those O members, I believe, they can submit comments, but many do not. What they're trying to do as O members is I think they're trying to just stay abreast of what's going on in the particular committee, perhaps learn and get up to speed. So there is that second category. And like in most organizations, for those who are familiar with standards development, the O membership or the non-P membership is kind of the consequence if you don't fulfill your obligations as a P member, as a voting member. If you don't do all the things that you're supposed to do to maintain your P membership, then sometimes there's that other O membership that you could turn into. I'll double check that and make sure that we get any correct information. I don't have the directives in front of me, but I'll go back and review that and provide any corrections if I find anything different.
Yes, and any of that information We will post along with the recording of this webinar, and this webinar recording should be up in the next 48 hours. I want to thank Vijay and Keith for their expertise and their time. That concludes today's webinar on 17024. Thank you.